The snow fell silently across the Belgian forest, each flake settling on frozen ground already stained with the chaos of war. It was December 1944, and the Battle of the Bulge had transformed the Ardennes into a landscape of suffering. In a makeshift American aid station carved into the ruins of a stone farmhouse, medics worked by candlelight and the occasional flare that illuminated the darkness outside. The wounded lay in rows, young men whose uniforms bore the insignia of the United States Army, groaning, bleeding, fighting for breath in the frigid air. Then came the sound that made every man who could still move reach for his weapon. Voices speaking German. Footsteps crunching through snow. The door burst open, and 3 Wehrmacht soldiers stumbled inside, dragging a fourth whose leg hung at an unnatural angle, blood streaming through makeshift bandages. The Americans raised their rifles. The Germans raised their hands. And in that moment, suspended between nations at war, something unexpected happened that would challenge everything both sides thought they knew about their enemy. What those German soldiers witnessed in the hours that followed would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Some would speak of it decades later, their voices still carrying notes of disbelief. Because what they saw wasn't what their propaganda had prepared them for. They had been told the Americans were barbaric, that they showed no mercy, that capture meant torture or death. Instead, they watched as American medics, boys barely old enough to shave, immediately moved toward the wounded German soldier. Not with weapons, but with medical supplies. The lead American medic, a corporal from Ohio named Robert Benish, made a decision in seconds that embodied a principle deeper than nationalism or ideology. He looked at the German with the shattered leg, then at his own wounded men lying in rows behind him, and he said, words that one of the German soldiers would remember for 50 years, "Get him on the table. He's bleeding out." This wasn't an isolated incident of battlefield mercy. Across every front where American forces fought in World War II, a pattern emerged that confounded both enemies and allies. While warfare demands that soldiers view the enemy as less than human, while training turns men into killers, while propaganda dehumanizes the opposition to make killing psychologically possible, American medical personnel consistently demonstrated something that seemed to contradict the very nature of war itself. They treated wounded enemy soldiers, not occasionally, not reluctantly, but as a matter of policy, practice, and deeply held conviction. The German High Command noticed this pattern early in the North African campaign. Intelligence reports compiled from interrogated prisoners began including strange notations. German soldiers reported receiving blood transfusions, pain medication, even surgery from American medical units. At first, German officers dismissed these reports as delusions, perhaps caused by trauma or drugs. Why would the enemy waste precious resources on prisoners? Why would they risk their own medical supplies on men who, if they recovered, might return to kill Americans? But the reports kept coming. From Tunisia to Sicily, from Normandy to the Rhine, the story remained consistent. Captured German soldiers told of American medics who worked on them with the same urgency, the same skill, the same apparent concern they showed their own wounded. In some cases, German soldiers reported receiving treatment before American casualties, a detail so incredible that Wehrmacht intelligence officers initially marked such reports as unreliable. The reality was more complex and more revealing than simple mercy. What the Germans were witnessing was the manifestation of a unique intersection in American military culture, a combination of medical ethics, inherited from civilian medicine, practical military calculation, democratic values that emphasized individual human worth, and something harder to quantify, a national character shaped by idealism even in the midst of total war. American combat medics, those young men who wore red crosses on white armbands and carried no weapons into battle, operated under the Geneva Convention's medical provisions. But many armies had signed those same conventions. The difference lay in how seriously the American military took those obligations and how thoroughly they had institutionalized them into training, culture, and field practice. At Camp Barkley in Texas, at Fort Sam Houston, at dozens of medical training facilities across the United States, every combat medic learned the same fundamental principle from day one. You treat whoever needs treatment, regardless of uniform. This wasn't presented as optional or situational. It was drilled in with the same intensity as battlefield medicine techniques themselves. Instructors emphasized that the medic's oath, like the physician's Hippocratic oath, transcended politics and nationality. But knowing a principle and following it when artillery is exploding around you, when your best friend lies dying 10 feet away, when the man you're treating might have killed your brothers in arms hours earlier, that requires something more than training. It requires a particular kind of moral courage that the American military, perhaps uniquely among World War II combatants, actively cultivated in its medical personnel. The farmhouse in Belgium grew quieter as Corporal Benisch worked on the German soldier's leg. The other Wehrmacht soldiers stood against the wall, watched over by 2 American infantrymen whose rifles never wavered but whose expressions had shifted from hostile alertness to something more complex. They watched their medic work with the same focused intensity he'd shown on their own wounds, watched him use precious sulfa powder and morphine and bandages on a man who wore the enemy's uniform. One of the standing Germans, a sergeant named Klaus Huber, spoke broken English. He asked the question that would be repeated in various forms across countless battlefields. Why you do this? Why you help him? Benisch didn't look up from his work, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he set the broken bone. Because he's hurt, he said, as if that explained everything. In a way it did. This philosophy had roots that extended far beyond military doctrine. American medicine in the 1940s existed at a unique intersection of scientific advancement and democratic idealism. The country's medical schools, its hospitals, its entire healthcare culture operated on principles that emphasize the sanctity of individual human life, regardless of social status, race, or theoretically at least nationality. When the military drafted doctors, nurses, and medics from civilian life, it absorbed these values along with medical expertise. Dr. Paul Hawley, the chief surgeon of the European Theater of Operations, had made the policy explicit in directives sent to every medical unit under his command. Enemy wounded were to receive treatment according to medical need, not nationality. The most severely wounded received care first, whether they were American, British, German, or Italian. This triage principle, though pragmatic in its medical logic, represented a radical humanitarianism in practice. The policy faced its first major test in North Africa in 1943. After the Battle of Kasserine Pass, American forces found themselves with hundreds of German and Italian prisoners, many severely wounded. The American medical system was already strained treating their own casualties from what had been a devastating defeat. Supply lines stretched across an ocean. Blood plasma was precious. Every bandage, every dose of morphine, every surgical instrument represented resources that might mean the difference between life and death for an American soldier. And yet the orders were clear. The wounded enemy soldiers were brought to American field hospitals, triaged alongside American casualties, and treated according to medical need. A German soldier with a sucking chest wound might receive surgery before an American with a broken arm. An Italian soldier bleeding out from shrapnel wounds might get blood plasma, while an American with relatively minor injuries waited. This created tension. American soldiers who had watched their friends die sometimes struggled to understand why enemy soldiers were receiving their medical supplies. There were confrontations, angry words, even threats directed at medical personnel. But the military medical command held firm, and something remarkable happened. Over time, the frontline troops began to accept and even respect the policy. They saw their own medics treated as non-combatants by the enemy. They saw wounded Americans returned in prisoner exchanges who reported receiving medical care, sometimes survival-saving care, from German doctors who cited the American example. The practical benefits of the Geneva Convention became apparent when both sides honored medical neutrality. More soldiers on both sides survived. But there was more to it than reciprocal pragmatism. American soldiers began to notice how the policy affected the enemy's will to fight. German soldiers who knew they would receive medical treatment if wounded were more likely to surrender when the tactical situation became hopeless, rather than fighting to the death. This saved American lives. Interrogations of prisoners who had received American medical care often yielded valuable intelligence, as gratitude and relief loosened tongues. In Italy, at the Anzio beachhead in early 1944, the pattern continued under some of the most brutal conditions of the war. American forces were pinned down on a narrow strip of beach, subjected to constant German artillery and counterattacks. Casualties were horrific on both sides. The American medical installations, marked with large red crosses, worked around the clock in conditions that tested every limit of endurance and supply. German prisoners brought to these aid stations told consistent stories of their treatment. They received the same antibiotics, the same surgical care, the same pain management as American soldiers. They ate the same rations, slept in the same tents, their wounds dressed with the same care. For many, this was disorienting. They had been raised on Nazi propaganda that depicted Americans as brutal capitalists who valued nothing but money and power, as a mongrel race inferior to Germanic purity. What they encountered instead challenged their entire worldview. One German lieutenant, captured with severe abdominal wounds, later wrote about watching an American surgeon work on him for 3 hours, fighting to save his life with the same intensity the surgeon showed for American patients. He was Jewish, the German wrote decades later, his tone still carrying wonder. I had been taught that Jews were subhuman, that they were cowards and devils. This man, this Jewish American, saved my life while I wore the uniform of a regime that was murdering his people by the millions. The psychological impact of this disconnect between propaganda and reality became a factor in the war's progression. As more German soldiers experienced American medical care, word spread through the Wehrmacht. Intelligence officers noted an increase in German soldiers attempting to surrender specifically to American units rather than Soviet forces, where they knew such treatment was far less likely. The contrast with the Eastern Front was stark and deliberate. Soviet forces, having suffered unimaginable brutality at German hands, showed little inclination toward medical mercy. German soldiers captured by the Russians faced grim prospects. This was understandable given the Nazis' war of annihilation in the East, the deliberate starvation of Soviet police, the atrocities that had claimed millions of Soviet lives. The American approach stood in stark contrast not just to Soviet practices but sometimes to their own allies. British medical units generally followed Geneva Convention protocols, but resource allocation often favored their own troops first. French forces, particularly those who had endured occupation and collaboration, sometimes struggled with treating German wounded with the same priority as their own. The American policy of strictly medical triage, regardless of nationality, was notable even among the Western allies. But it wasn't uniform or perfect. The policy existed alongside profound contradictions in American military culture. The same army that treated wounded Germans with medical equality maintained segregated units for black soldiers. The same military medical system that saved enemy lives operated field hospitals where black medics sometimes couldn't work on white patients. Where Japanese-American soldiers, even those serving with extraordinary valor, faced discrimination and suspicion. These contradictions didn't escape notice, especially among black medics who saw them with painful clarity. They were trained to treat everyone equally, told that medical ethics transcended race and nationality, then faced a military structure that maintained racial hierarchies. Some processed this by focusing on the medical work itself, finding in the treatment of wounded enemy soldiers a purity of purpose that military segregation denied them elsewhere. A black medic named James Tillman, serving with a segregated medical unit in France, later recalled treating German POWs who seemed shocked that a black man held such responsibility and authority. "They'd been told we were subhuman," he said. "Then here I am, saving their lives, making medical decisions, doing things their own propaganda said I couldn't possibly do." I could see it in their eyes, everything they'd been taught was falling apart. In the Pacific Theater, the dynamic shifted in troubling ways. The American policy of treating wounded enemies applied in theory to Japanese soldiers, but cultural and tactical differences made implementation far more complex. Japanese military culture emphasized death before surrender. Wounded Japanese soldiers sometimes used their injuries to lure American medics close before detonating grenades, killing themselves, and there would be rescuers. This created an impossible situation for American medical personnel who wanted to honor their ethical obligations but faced an enemy whose tactical doctrine weaponized medical mercy. The result was a tragic deterioration of medical conventions in the Pacific. American medics became wary, then hostile toward treating Japanese wounded. Instances of mercy occurred but became exceptions rather than the rule. Japanese soldiers who did surrender and receive treatment often expressed profound shock, but their numbers remained relatively small throughout the war. The contrast between the European and Pacific theaters revealed the limits of medical idealism when facing an enemy whose entire military culture rejected the premises of the Geneva Convention. Yet even in Europe, where the policy flourished most fully, it operated within the brutal calculus of total war. American strategic bombing killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians. American artillery and air support devastated German cities. The same military that treated wounded enemy soldiers with medical care was simultaneously pursuing a strategy of unconditional, Surrender that accepted enormous casualties on all sides as necessary to achieve total victory. How did individual medics reconcile these contradictions? How did they process treating a wounded German soldier with care and compassion, then watching that same evening as Allied bombers flew overhead toward German cities? The answer varied by individual, but certain patterns emerged in later interviews and memoirs. Many medics compartmentalized. The battlefield and the aid station existed in different moral universes. In combat, you killed the enemy. In the medical area, you saved lives. The Red Cross on the armband represented not just a Geneva Convention marker, but a psychological boundary between two different sets of ethical rules. Others found in medical work a kind of redemption for the violence they witnessed and sometimes participated in. Medics saw the worst of what war did to human bodies. They held dying men, watched young soldiers bleed out, witnessed injuries that defied comprehension. Treating enemy wounded became a way to assert meaning in the face of senseless destruction, to exercise agency toward life in an enterprise dedicated to death. Corporal Benisch, working on the German soldier in that Belgian farmhouse, was performing a routine task he'd executed dozens of times. But for the German soldiers watching, it represented something unprecedented in their experience of war. They had served in Poland, where Wehrmacht brutality had been policy. They had fought in Russia, where the conflict had devolved into mutual atrocity. They expected the Americans to be different only in the specifics of cruelty. What they witnessed instead forced a reckoning. When Benisch finished setting the leg, when he'd administered morphine and antibiotics, when he'd done everything his training and ethics demanded, the wounded German soldier looked up at him with an expression that mixed pain, confusion, and something approaching gratitude. He spoke in German, words the Americans didn't understand but the other prisoners translated. "Why are you not like they told us you would be?" It was a question that cut to the heart of propaganda, nationalism, and the constructed hatreds that make war possible. Both sides had been taught to dehumanize the enemy. Both had been given narratives that explained why the other deserved destruction. But medical care, the intimate act of trying to preserve life, broke through those narratives in ways that rhetoric couldn't counter. The German sergeant, Klaus Huber, watched the scene with thoughts that would occupy him for the rest of his life. He had joined the Wehrmacht believing in German superiority, in the righteousness of the Nazi cause, in the necessity of conquest. Doubt had crept in during the Eastern Front campaigns, where he'd witnessed atrocities that troubled even his indoctrinated conscience. But he'd rationalized, compartmentalized, continued following orders. Now he stood in an American aid station, watching an enemy medic save his comrade's life with the same dedication he'd show for his own brothers. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. If the Americans were the monsters Nazi propaganda claimed, they would have shot them all on sight or left them to bleed out in the snow. If American soldiers were the weak, decadent, racially inferior people he'd been taught they were, they wouldn't fight with the ferocity he'd witnessed in combat, and they wouldn't show this kind of disciplined compassion toward enemies. As dawn broke over the Belgian forest, the farmhouse aid station continued its work. The wounded German had been stabilized and would be evacuated to a rear area hospital along with the American casualties. The 3 uninjured German soldiers would be processed as prisoners of war. Before they were led away, Corporal Benisch did something that seemed small but carried symbolic weight. He offered them coffee from the medic's own supply, a gesture of simple human acknowledgement that transcended the fact of their captivity. Years later, after the war, Klaus Huber would write about that moment in a letter to the International Red Cross, hoping they might help him locate the American medic who had treated his friend. He never found. Benisch records were incomplete, fates unknown, the chaos of war having scattered millions across the globe. But the memory remained vivid, and Huber spoke of it to his children and grandchildren as a defining moment in his life. "I understood then," he wrote, "that we had been lied to. Not just about military matters or strategic situation, but about fundamental questions of human worth. The Americans showed us that mercy and strength could coexist, that you could be a formidable enemy and still recognize the humanity of those you fought. This was not weakness. It was a kind of power we had never developed." Huber's reflection touched on something crucial. The American policy of treating enemy wounded wasn't primarily about kindness, though kindness was involved. It was about maintaining a moral framework, even in the midst of total war, about asserting certain values as non-negotiable even when everything else was at stake. In doing so, it demonstrated a form of strength that pure military might couldn't achieve alone. The impact extended beyond individual encounters. At the strategic level, American treatment of prisoners and wounded became a propaganda tool, but one based on truth rather than fabrication. Leaflets dropped over German lines told soldiers they would receive medical care if captured. Unlike most propaganda, these claims could be verified by soldiers who had been captured and later exchanged, or who communicated with comrades through Red Cross channels. This created a subtle but significant erosion of German fighting morale, particularly in the war's final year. German soldiers increasingly faced a choice between dying for a lost cause or surrendering to an enemy who, despite the terrible destruction of war, would at least treat their wounds and preserve their lives. When ideology failed, when the promised German victory turned to certain defeat, when propaganda could no longer obscure reality, practical considerations of survival gained weight. The American medical treatment of enemy wounded paid dividends that military planners hadn't fully anticipated. Post-war interrogations revealed that knowledge of American medical policies had influenced surrender decisions for thousands of German soldiers. In the Battle of the Bulge alone, American intelligence estimated that several hundred Germans surrendered specifically because they knew their wounds would be treated rather than fighting to the death or attempting to retreat in conditions that would have been fatal. But reducing the policy to strategic utility misses its deeper significance. What the American military medical system demonstrated, imperfectly and with numerous contradictions, was that certain principles could survive even the total war that World War II represented. The medics who treated enemy wounded weren't thinking about strategic advantages or post-war propaganda benefits. They were following training, ethics, and a fundamental conviction that their role was to preserve life, period. Dr. Hawley, the chief surgeon who had established the policy, later reflected on its importance beyond the immediate medical outcomes. "We were fighting fascism," he said in a 1950 interview. Fascism denied the fundamental equality of human beings, created hierarchies of worth based on race and nationality. Every time our medics treated a wounded German soldier with the same care they'd give an American, we were making a statement about what we believed in. We were demonstrating the values we claimed to be fighting for. This wasn't mere rhetoric. The post-war order that emerged from Allied victory, particularly the human rights frameworks and international humanitarian law that developed in the following decades, was built partially on precedents established by practices like American medical treatment of enemy combatants. The Nuremberg trials affirmed that certain ethical principles transcended national sovereignty and military necessity. The Geneva Conventions were strengthened and expanded. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights asserted inherent human dignity regardless of nationality or circumstance. These developments didn't arise from abstract philosophy alone. They emerged from the lived experience of war, from moments like that farmhouse in Belgium where young men faced choices about how to treat fellow human beings who wore enemy uniforms. The accumulation of thousands of such moments, the consistent application of medical ethics across theaters of war, created a practical demonstration that international humanitarian law could function even in total war. The medics themselves rarely spoke in such grand terms. When interviewed in later decades, most described their work in practical, matter-of-fact language. They had been trained to provide medical care. Wounded people needed medical care. They did their job. The philosophical implications, the strategic impacts, the historical significance, these were afterthoughts, if they thought of them at all. Yet their actions spoke to something profound about American identity in the mid-20th century, something that existed alongside and sometimes in tension with the nation's many failures and contradictions. There was a strain of idealism, sometimes naive but deeply felt, that insisted certain values were worth upholding even at cost. That saving a life mattered even if that life belonged to someone trying to kill you hours earlier. That professional ethics and human compassion could survive in conditions designed to destroy both. This idealism wasn't universal or consistent. The same nation that produced medics who treated enemy wounded also produced the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The same military that maintained medical equality for enemy combatants maintained racial segregation for its own troops. The same democratic values that emphasized individual human worth coexisted with systemic discrimination and inequality at home. But the contradictions don't erase the significance of the moments when those ideals were honored. History is made not just by grand strategies and decisive battles, but by individual moral choices repeated across thousands of small human encounters. The German soldiers who received American medical care, who were treated with competence and a fundamental respect for their humanity, carried those experiences forward. Some, like Klaus Huber, allowed those experiences to challenge and ultimately change their understanding of the world. The legacy extends to present-day military medical ethics. The principles established and practiced in World War II became codified in subsequent conflicts. American military medical personnel in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan have operated under similar doctrines: treat wounded regardless of nationality, triage based on medical need, maintain medical ethics even in combat zones. The execution has varied, mistakes and failures have occurred, but the principle remains embedded in military medical training and culture. As the sun rose fully over the Belgian forest that December morning in 1944, Corporal Benish and his fellow medics continued their work. The farmhouse aid station would operate for another 2 days before advancing American forces allowed it to move forward. In that time, it would treat dozens more casualties, both American and German. For the medics, it was routine. For the Germans who passed through, it remained shocking, a confrontation with an enemy who insisted on recognizing their humanity even in the midst of trying to destroy their army. War's end. The snow that fell that December melted with spring. The Third Reich collapsed, bringing with it the ideology that had sent millions to their deaths. Soldiers returned home, carrying memories of what they had done and witnessed, carrying wounds both visible and hidden. And scattered among those memories, in the minds of German soldiers who had encountered American medical care, was the persistent question: what does it mean when your enemy treats you better than your own propaganda claimed they would? That question, asked in different forms across different battlefields, represents perhaps the most subversive challenge to the constructed hatreds that make war possible. When you encounter humanity in those you've been taught to dehumanize, when you receive mercy from those you've been told are merciless, the narratives that sustain conflict begin to crack. Not always, not easily, but inevitably. The shock that German troops expressed when American medics treated their wounded wasn't just surprise at receiving medical care. It was the shock of cognitive dissonance, the disorienting recognition that reality contradicted everything their indoctrination had taught them. In that shock lay the seeds of understanding the possibility that enemies could recognize each other's humanity without ceasing to be enemies, that war could be fought without abandoning all ethical constraints, that even in humanity's darkest hours, some light persists. This is the story worth remembering, not because it makes war noble or erases its horrors, but because it demonstrates that even in total war, humans retain the capacity for choice. The medics who treated wounded enemy soldiers chose to honor their ethical obligations despite easier alternatives. The military command that established and enforced those policies chose to maintain principles despite costs. And in doing so, they left a legacy that extends far beyond the battlefield, a reminder that humanity's better angels can survive even its worst conflicts. The farmhouse in Belgium is long gone, returned to peaceful fields, or perhaps built over by the decades of reconstruction and development. The men who worked there, who made those choices in the snow and candlelight, have mostly passed on. But the choices remain, echoing forward, asking each generation the same question: what principles will you uphold when upholding them is hardest? What values will define you when everything else is stripped away? The answers to those questions, written in actions more than words, in medical care provided to enemies, inhumanity recognized amid inhumanity, remain among World War II's most quietly profound legacies.